Okay, welcome back everyone. I am Jane and I will be chairing the final session for today on achieving climate justice through resisting inequality. And our presenters we have with us is Tim Gore and Hein Marais. Tim will be speaking on the Carbon Inequality Report, and then Hein, post-work, the Just Transition and the Universal Basic Income Grant. So we've got an hour for this session, and then we will end off with a way forward by Bish. So I'm going to hand over to Tim, and then Hein, and then we'll have the discussion.
All right.
Go for it, Tim.
Thank you, Jane. Can you hear me okay? I'm going to try and share my screen. Yeah, I hear all of you guys. Are you seeing that? Sharing the screen?
Yeah, I see that. It's fine. Thanks.
Yep.
Great. So I just put it in presentation. It works. There. Okay, fantastic. Well, thanks so much for inviting me. As an outsider to South Africa, it's been fascinating so far. And yeah, I hope what I'm going to present could be useful set of resources that can support all of the brilliant work and discussions that you're having amongst the community there. So I'm going to present this work that we published in September, and some new analysis which goes beyond what we've published so far. So essentially, it's 3 different levels of carbon inequality that I'm going to talk about. The global carbon inequality, so that's comparing the emissions of people on high and low incomes wherever they live in the world, and that's what we've published so far. I'll also give you a snapshot of what the picture looks like in Africa as a continent, so comparing the emissions of Africans on high and low incomes wherever in the continent they live, and then zoom in on the situation in South Africa, comparing the emissions of people on high and low incomes in South Africa specifically. So just a quick note on the method here. What are we doing? We're trying to estimate how carbon emissions are linked to the consumption of individuals around the world. So what are consumption emissions? Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with this, but there's a widely recognized method to allocate global emissions, not to where they were produced, but to the point of consumption of the goods and services for which those emissions were generated. So it uses input-output trade databases, and essentially it reflects the emissions that are produced in a country plus those emissions that are embedded in imports, subtracting the emissions embedded in exports. And what we do, we take national consumption emissions data for about 117 countries over a period between 1990 and 2015, and we allocate those national consumption emissions totals to individuals within the countries based on an assumed relationship between income and emissions, which is based on lots of studies, and I won't go into the exact assumptions, but can do in the questions if they're interested. And then we can then resort those national emissions distributions in different ways, either into a single global distribution, regional level, or just look at the national distributions themselves. So there are 3 things that we launched in September. If you want to know more about all of this, there was a technical report that we produced together with the Stockholm Environment Institute. So we worked with them on the numbers. That's called the Carbon Inequality Era. The link is there. We then produced as Oxfam a slightly more political, media-focused report called Confronting Carbon Inequality, putting it a little bit more into a political context. But we've also made available the full data set, so it's there, and I'll be dipping into that to present some of the findings. But it's the idea is that it's there as a new tool, a new resource for the movement to draw from. And we are building further analysis based on that, which is going to be coming out soon. So we've got a piece looking at inequality within the EU coming up in just a few weeks. And we're working with a number of different organizations on a Pan-African analysis. And I know there's interest in producing more analysis in South Africa and India, other places. So we look at this 25-year period, and first just a word really on the context here. First, remember that the climate crisis is driven not by the emissions at any particular point in time, but by the cumulative emissions that gather in the atmosphere over time. And we look at this 25-year period, which is really a critical period in the history of the climate crisis, because the total emissions added to the atmosphere, the total cumulative emissions doubled in this period. So that means the same amount of carbon that was added really since the start of the Industrial Revolution up until 1990 was added again in just those 25 years. Remember as well, this is a period which coincides with the publication of the first IPCC report. So arguably after this point, the world knew the dangers of accumulating greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and yet proceeded almost regardless. But it's also, of course, a really interesting period from a political economy perspective, because it's a period in which global GDP doubles, extreme poverty falls, mostly due to China, but also inequality really explodes around the world in most countries, and such that even at the end of this period, even after that huge expansion of the size of the global economy, still about half the world is earning less than the $5.50 per day line. So it's an incredibly inefficient means, to say the least, of ending poverty. And the result of all of this is that since it's the total amount of carbon that's added to the atmosphere that determines the extent of the climate crisis, we can define a budget, a total amount that we can add if we want to limit global heating, for example, to the 1.5 degree goal of the Paris Agreement. And the result is that right now we are perilously close. We are on the verge of exceeding that total amount. On current trends, we will exceed it within the next approximately 9 years. And so I think what Vish and others were saying earlier, that this really is the last chance saloon, that we can't be having these debates again in 10 years' time. This is it. This is the last moment to change course before that budget is entirely depleted. So that's a word on the context, and now I'll get into some of the findings. So first, on the global carbon inequality. So who drove those emissions in this period? So here we present, we break the global population down into these 5 main global income groups. We look at the richest 1%, so the top 1% of earners globally, wherever they live in the world. We look at the top 10%, the middle 40%, and then the bottom 50% of the global population. And you can see in the middle how the emissions are allocated to those different income groups over the period from 1990 to 2015. And the numbers represent the cumulative emissions, the share of cumulative emissions that can be attributed to each of those groups. So you can see that the richest 10% globally were responsible for over half, 52% of the emissions, and the richest 1% alone were responsible for more than double the emissions of the poorest half of humanity. And then on the right-hand side, in the bar chart, you can see what those cumulative emissions meant in terms of the depletion of the global carbon budget. So this really is that's the global commons, as you like, as we've been talking about earlier today. So the richest 10% depleted the global carbon commons by around about a third in just those 25 years alone. Here's some other ways of depicting that. You can say that the richest 10% have produced about the same emissions as the rest of the world combined, and the richest 1% were responsible for double the emissions of the poorest 50. The other thing that we can look at is the growth in emissions over this period, and try and understand, well, who was driving that growth in global emissions. And I think it's common in many debates on international climate action, particularly in northern countries. I'm from the UK, I live in Sweden, but it's common to point the finger at middle-income countries, China, India, and say that was the reason that global emissions have exploded in this period, because there were millions of people that were escaping poverty and deprivation. And for sure, we can see that made a big impact on global emissions. But actually, what we can show is that the biggest contribution to the growth in total emissions came from the very richest people on the planet. And we can show that with what we call the dinosaur chart. So this time we are dividing the population into ventiles, so fifths of the population, or 5% of the population, from the top 5% richest on the right-hand side to the bottom 5% poorest on the left-hand side. And the light green bars show what their total emissions were in 1990, and the dark green bars show what they were in 2015. So you can see that all groups increased their emissions by some extent. But if we then show that in the line as the proportion of the total growth that came from those different groups, you can see that the richest 5% alone were responsible for over a third, 37% of the growth, and the richest 10% together for about 46% of the growth. And that's about the same as the entire global middle class. About 3 billion people, produced about the same. So we can see the extreme concentration of economic growth and the consequences in terms of consumption emissions through this chart, and the poorest 50% of the population barely increasing their emissions at all in this period. So what are the big takeaways here from the global level? We already know that highly unequal growth is a really inefficient way at best of reducing poverty. At current rates, it's going to take hundreds of years to get everybody above the $5.50 line. But I think what this shows is that there's a second cost as well, which is that the carbon budget is being squandered primarily or largely to expand the consumption of people that are already affluent and not for the purposes of poverty reduction. And as we know well, the kinds of groups that suffer that injustice first and foremost. So in terms of an agenda for action, this graph is a way of showing how the per capita emissions of those different groups can compare. So the per capita emissions here are shown with the black dots, and the green bars are the total emissions associated with those groups. And the line at the bottom is where global average per capita emissions need to be in 2030 to get on track to limiting global heating to 1.5 degrees. So that's about 2 tons per capita by 2030. You can see that the poorest 50% are still some way below that line. So there is still space for the poorest 50% to double, even treble their average emissions to reach that level. But it's at the top end of the distribution where we need to see really big reductions, and the top 10% richest are currently over 10 times above the level that we need to be by 2030, and the 1% over 30 times where they need to be by 2030. This is some of the coverage that we got. I think just interesting that already actually this kind of analysis has been picked up even by Gutierrez and Espinosa. So it's sort of starting already to become sort of reasonably mainstream, which means I think we have struck a chord, and that these ideas about the extent of carbon inequality in the world are becoming more normalized in a way, and maybe that has opportunities for us in terms of thinking about more radical solutions, but perhaps also signals a certain amount of apathy that people just expect this to be normal now, but are not even necessarily that shocked by it. Right, let's have a look at the picture in Africa. These are the African consumption emissions. First thing to say is that, as you guys will all know, Africa's emissions as a continent are a tiny fraction of global emissions. So everything produced, all of the consumption emissions from Africa in this period amount to about 3% of global cumulative emissions. But they did nonetheless grow significantly, more than doubled in this time. So we can ask who benefited from that. And it's overwhelmingly, of course, the richest 10% of Africans who have been responsible for those cumulative emissions in that period, and the poorest 50% barely for anything at all, with 4% of African emissions, which is just 3% of global emissions. It's completely negligible contribution to the climate crisis. And if we look at that in a per capita basis, then we can see the, of course, highly unequal within Africa. So the top 10% per capita emissions about 60 times higher than the average of the poorest 50% in Africa. And the top 10% have a per capita footprint about the same as the EU average. So that just gives you a sense of sort of how that compares with other parts of the world, at least with the EU. And then the question would be, well, where in Africa are those highest income and highest emitters? Well, it won't surprise any of you to know that South Africa is the country with the highest national consumption emissions in the continent, and also that the biggest share of Africa's high income top emitters are from South Africa. So let's have a look finally at the situation in South Africa. These are the South African consumption emissions, and they really are a microcosm of the global picture, only with even more striking emissions growth concentrated amongst the top income earners. So you can see that the top 10% richest people in South Africa accounted for 56% of cumulative emissions over the period, with the bottom 50% for around 11%. But I think what is, even more striking is that, and you can see it quite clearly on this graph, that huge growth being driven really amongst the top 10%, those richest income groups. The bottom 50% and the middle 40%, they remain pretty flat over the period, and all of the growth in emissions is coming at the top of the income spectrum in South Africa. So if we then have a look with that on the sort of dinosaur chart for South Africa, you can really see that very strikingly, and actually it's extraordinary. It's the most unequal of any of the countries that we've looked at so far, and the top 5% accounting for 73% of the growth in annual emissions in South Africa over this period, and the top 10% together accounting for 95% of annual emissions growth. So that is the story of highly unequal, highly carbon intensive growth in the South African economy over this period, and the result is that there's been a huge expansion in the consumption emissions of the very, very richest South Africans, and barely any increase amongst most of the rest of the population at all. We look at that in per capita terms, just to put it in some context. You see that the richest 1% in South Africa, those are amongst the richest, they've got amongst the highest per capita incomes anywhere in the world, significantly higher even than the top 1% earners in the European Union. So that's as high as, as I say, almost any country anywhere in the world. And the top 10% of the South African income earners have per capita consumption emissions that are substantially higher than the top 10% in the European Union, and nearly 20 times higher than the target for 2030. So, I think if you're looking for an agenda for climate justice in South Africa, looking at those very high footprints of the top 10% and the top 1% has got to be part of the picture to reduce those substantially over the next 10 years. And you can't really see it because of the scale, but the bottom 50% in South Africa are equally amongst some of the poorest anywhere on the planet, and therefore with some of the lowest emissions of anyone on the planet, and still substantial space for increasing the footprints of those households, as long as there are these very substantial declines amongst the top income earners. So just a final slide then, in terms of what's an agenda to start to tackle all of this. And I don't think it's not for me to say, and it's been fascinating to learn already from all of you about the ideas that are coming from South Africa with regard to rethinking the economy and how to respond to some of these challenges. Clearly, we would also say that these are structural drivers of this extreme inequality. It's the basis of neoliberal extractivist economics. We're not trying to shift responsibility here to individuals. It's just these individual footprints are themselves a product of the system, of the structure of the economy. I think at a fairly superficial level, we should be thinking about measures which more directly target the emissions of top income groups everywhere. And as our forthcoming European analysis is going to show, that even in Europe, where you have seen a decline in emissions since 1990, those emission reductions have only come amongst the poorer, lower income earners in Europe. So the top earners in Europe haven't reduced their emissions at all. So everywhere we need to have measures which more squarely target the excessive emissions of the highest earners, and things like wealth taxes, progressive income taxes, luxury carbon consumption taxes, should all be in the mix as part of that agenda. But I guess the bigger picture, which other speakers have been touching on, is about the nature of the economy. What is the challenge we really face here? It's about redistribution, but it's no longer just redistribution of a growing economy. It's redistribution within ecological limits. It's redistribution in a context in which our aggregate global energy demand has to decline substantially over the next 10 years. We're essentially talking about a fairer sharing, not of a growing pie, but of a shrinking pie. And so that does require us to do some quite fundamental rethinking about our political economy. Others have talked already about restructuring or redistributing the economy away from certain sectors, extractivist sectors, towards what we could call regenerative sectors like healthcare, social care, certain forms of agriculture. Others have also talked about moving beyond GDP, different types of regulation of the private sector to get away from short-termism, to force companies to make products which can be reused, promoting alternative business models, more worker ownership, banning advertising, at least in public spaces, for example. And I think as the next presentation is going to come on to, thinking about universal basic income and the expansion of public services as a means of alleviating that pressure on individuals and communities to feel they have to earn, they have to accumulate income just to meet basic needs. So I think those are the kind of really radical ideas which can get to the root causes of this structural inequality. And I just have a couple of words on the kind of international dimension here. I've spent a lot of time at the UN climate negotiations on these climate finance questions and so on. And I think, it's just worth flagging that it's still the majority of the top income highest emitters are in OECD countries, although you find them in every part of the world now, in every continent, including in South Africa. But at the UNFCCC, therefore, there is still very clearly a role for financial flows from global north to global south as a recognition of, you can call it climate debt, you can find other terminology, but there is clearly a need for that. The 100 billion is clearly inadequate. The debate is now starting on a new collective finance target, which is due to be in place by 2025. That was set in the Paris Agreement. So, another strand of advocacy could be towards pushing the Africa group of negotiators to getting serious this time about the kind of target that's needed. I think Lumumba was mentioned in an earlier presentation. What can be learned from the Africa group this time going into that debate, so that the same if you like, mistakes are not recreated. And then there's the whole question as well about loss and damage finance. So some big new areas to explore as well on the international level, as well as getting the domestic political economy right. Thanks so much, and look forward to the discussion.
That's really fascinating research. Thank you for sharing with us, Tim. We're going to hand straight over to Hein, who will share with us on post-work, the just transition, and the universal basic income grant. Thank you, Hein.
Thanks, Jane. Thank you, Tim. That was fascinating. I'm not going to share slides with you. It's going to be me talking through things that aren't necessarily very friendly to graphs and things at the moment. And let's start by just an obvious observation, which is that we think of the transition as something that's lying out in the future, but of course we are being swept along by a transition as we sit here and as we speak. We have these series of upheavals and crises that are driven at the moment by a kind of path dependency produced by 250 years of industrial capitalism. So we are experiencing the sad to say, lower slopes of an accumulation of upheaval and crisis, and these are going to intensify and amplify. A small example is the fact that we've seen 10 major financial crises since the early 1970s, at least 10. We've seen 2 global economic crises in the last 8 years. Our lives, our societies, the conditions for life are being transformed, and it's a transition that is inevitable and requires us to, as we're trying to do, try and think in ways in which we not only accommodate ourselves and our societies and the ways in which we structure life and economies to this reality, but whether we can bend these processes in a direction that is more just and more egalitarian. In the South African case, this outlook that I've just summarized here is projected onto a reality which, seen from the outside, already looks like a kind of a dystopia. We live in a society where paid work is treated as the core foundation for our material security, our ability to feed ourselves and our families, our entitlements, our well-being, our sense of social inclusion is all tied to being able to sell our labor out in the market. And it's an economy at the same time, which, as Tim has shown here very powerfully in those graphs, generates vast but mal-distributed wealth. And the trick is it does this without the paid labor of around about 40% of the working age population. We have our narrow, very unreasonably calculated employment rate of around 29% expanded to 40% of the population being unemployed. This high unemployment trend dates back for decades. There's no indication and no empirical basis for thinking it will change significantly in the future, at least the foreseeable future. So we have perhaps a majority of low and semi-skilled workers in South Africa whose working life comprises these short periods of employment bracketed by unpredictable durations of unemployment. And we have large proportions of people who are in employment receiving wages that are so low that they require subsidies from family members and from the state in order to survive and feed themselves and put their kids through school. So it's a prevailing set of conditions that effectively reflects a double fiction. The idea that paid work's available to those who seek it, and that this work assures us a basic modicum of security and well-being. And I think it bears no reminding that this crisis of wage work in South Africa will intensify. It will intensify as the economic instabilities persist, ramped up by the dominance of financial capital. It's, of course, in turn sets off a series of periodic crises. It will intensify as natural crises and disasters tied to global warming increase. And it will intensify and become more difficult to deal with as we are perforce phasing out or overhauling carbon-intensive industries and forms of economic activity. I'm not even talking about the potential impact of automation and other job-replacing technologies as they become profitable for capital to introduce into production and distribution systems. This is not to say that more and decent work isn't necessary. It's quite obviously important and necessary, but it is a tragically incomplete focus for any attempt to deal with the future that we're already caught up in. It leads us, I think, to a position where we have to seriously think of alternatives, including the one that I will be discussing very briefly today, the possibility of a universal basic income. We all know that there was an attempt to put a basic income grant on the map in the early 2000s in South Africa. It failed ultimately, and it's a whole discussion to be had about why it failed and so on. It's not what I'm interested in discussing today, though. I want to start off by just sketching for you what I mean by a universal basic income, because it's a highly contested concept. It has advocates, supporters, and critics right across the political spectrum. And they all tend to operate with slightly different ideas of what a UBI amounts to. And I think the slipperiness of the concept is both positive and negative. It's positive because it's made it possible for a potentially transgressive option to become the subject of mainstream debate. It's negative because we end up talking about very different things when we say the words basic income or universal basic income. And we have to be clear, therefore, what we mean. And I'm using the royal we there because what I mean by universal basic income is not one that is replacing other forms of social entitlement, the social wage, the existing social policy infrastructure. It is one that is ancillary to that. It complements that system and hopefully also will support and complement the expansion of those forms of provisioning. So I'm going to be very clear about that. At root, having said that, a basic income is a regular income that's paid unconditionally to individuals without any work requirement or any other conditionality attached to it. And it works as a supplement to the existing forms of social and other protection. The supplementary fixture is vital. So it's not a technocratic fix. It's not seen as a magic bullet that can go in and transform reality around it. We need to be clear about that, those sets of definitions that I've tried to sketch for you right there. What potential impact can a UBI have? Very, very briefly. We know that it can reduce poverty. We know this from the UBI pilots, cash transfer studies. We know it from the impact of minimum wages, for example, that when you increase the income levels, even by small margins of very low income earners, it reduces poverty. The extent to which that does it is, of course, dependent on all sorts of other variables. Depending on how a UBI is financed, it can reduce income inequality, which is a vital challenge for us. It can also improve other social outcomes, including maternal and child health, education enrollment and achievement in schools, provide women with greater financial autonomy, to some extent support the restructuring of gender relations and divisions of labor in the household and so on. There's a lot of study evidence supporting these contentions. It can also tighten the labor supply to some extent, to the extent that it enables potentially low income workers, wage earners, to turn down work, knowing that they have the means of which to survive and wait for a job that pays a better wage or offers work on somewhat better terms. It can boost aggregate demand for basic goods and services, which, if happening at a large enough scale, can stimulate local economic production and labor demand. And as I've hinted already, it can tighten the labor supply. By doing that, increase the reservation wage, at least at the lowest wage levels. So if all that plays out, it has this potential to enhance the collective strength of workers in and out of work, function as a kind of a permanent strike fund, if you like. So instead of having to accept these super exploitative, low-paying, insecure forms of employment, people can put their labor and time to other uses, and that can be care and other socially and community useful work, study, acquire new skills, go fishing, as Marx would have it, paint, kinds of things we set aside in our leisure time when we have that luxury. What has all of this got to do with the just transition, and how might it support that? I think that if we bear in mind these types of possibilities, these types of benefits a UBI can contribute, given favorable circumstances and context, that it can support strategies to manage these climate change shocks and achieve a just transition. And it can do so roughly in some of the following ways. A just transition, of course, involves and draws together concerns about not only environmental justice, but also about economic justice. We have to avoid trade-offs between people's livelihood security and the environment as societies adjust. And in saying that, we have to remind ourselves, of course, that the costs and impact of major economic restructuring is typically distributed very unequally and very unjustly across societies, across workforces, and across geographies. We find higher skilled workers, management level, and the wealthy tend to have more and better access to new career paths, new forms of livelihood than the lower echelons of workers do. And that's just one respect in which they tend to be, in a sense, left out of the calculations that design these economic restructuring strategies. And it will take active state-led intervention to temper and to avoid that tendency. And I think a UBI can be an important part, an important to prevent the cost of restructuring from being unloaded onto workers and their communities. It speaks to a number of areas of concern, I think. The one is that it addresses, in ways I'll just describe in a minute, the jobs blackmail component of arguments that are wielded against the environmental justice movement. We often have this stock a retort that yes, it's all very important, it's very good for us to restructure economic activity in these ways, but jobs will be lost, communities will be destroyed, etc., etc. A UBI can help counteract the potential resistance to this transition among workers in heavily infected sectors by providing a tangible and predictable support that goes beyond the retraining and the reskilling programs, and that supports displaced workers and their vulnerable communities in a tangible and reliable way. So it helps prevent shifts towards environmental sustainability from necessarily coming at the expense of poor communities. It can also support the redistribution of labor away from extractivist activities towards activities, as I hinted a few minutes ago, that support and drive social reproduction in the community, in the household, and in wider society, in the form of basic food production, for example, as Dick mentioned earlier this morning. And in the background, of course, are the advantages, the benefits that I touched on already. Poverty reduction, at least absolute poverty reduction, the potential to contribute to more equitable distributions of income, in the sense that it can benefit the poor more than the rich, thereby reducing relative poverty as well. And it can enhance basic freedoms, freedom to say no to work that is demeaning, dangerous, and exploitative, without aggravating inequalities. So it has this transformative potential embedded in it. It doesn't mean this potential is necessarily unlocked or unleashed in society, but a progressive vision of a UBI, I think, can see it and needs to see it as more than a social policy tool that's merely there to alleviate poverty and reduce inequality. It has a transgressive potential that can become part of a broader push for social and economic change. What do I mean by that? It I think has an ideological power and a transgressive ideological content which we should not overlook. It undermines very core principles about the value systems that are associated with industrial capitalism. Going back to my comments right at the beginning, this idea that paid work is the fundamental precondition for survival, for social citizenship, and for social inclusion. And on top of that, for our own sense of self-worth and the status that we manage to achieve in our communities. Implicit in a basic income is an understanding that factors beyond individual control decide the distribution of means and opportunities in societies. It brings this principle of social justice to the fore in the guise of a social policy tool or intervention. And it also implies that value is produced by society as a whole, that the entirety of society is entitled to a rightful share of the total social product. It challenges ultimately, and I'm almost done with this short presentation, it challenges, in other words, how we think about entitlement, how we think about rights, and how we think about how all of that is distributed in society. And in doing so, it raises very big questions about the prevailing assumptions we have about the sorts of claims we legitimately have on one another as members of society, that we have on the state, and about the roles and the duties of the state. So it is a potentially disruptive, in the best of possible ways, concept, irrespective of how it plays out in reality, which is why I think the debate around a basic income is fundamentally important. And it's fundamentally important to start the debate with a very clear set of definitions about what kind of basic income we're talking about. So we don't get caught up in the end, for me, fruitless arguments about it is simply a Trojan horse for neoliberal adjustment. It's just commodify life even further, etc. If we define it in the ways I've suggested as part of a expansive set of social policy interventions that build on what is there already and that extend rather and expand social provisioning, we can look at it as a tool, an intervention that has great transformative potential. We, I think, have no choice but to do this because we are living in a period where there are these an epochal, unprecedented changes are underway. We have to go beyond thinking in terms of recuperating, of remaking missed opportunities, of recovering lost grounds. In South Africa, at least, there is no golden age to be reclaimed. We have to venture into new territory if we're going to make it through what's lying ahead of us here. And I think a serious look at a UBI is an important part, or has to be an important part of that search, that exploration that we're all engaged in here. Having said this, and in conclusion, there are huge unanswered questions, big challenges, and potential risks that are attached to a UBI. I'll touch on a few. Who should get a UBI? How do we determine eligibility? How big should the amount be? Is it affordable? that of course is tied to eligibility and the size of a UBI. How do we prevent it from being captured and used to chip away at other social entitlements and other social provisioning? How does it compare, for example, with the jobs guarantee? Are the two compatible? We don't know the answers to these questions until we've examined them rigorously. And it's a process I'm trying to do at the moment. I'm drawing on a lot of other good thinking that goes before me, but it's one that I will warn you doesn't arrive or bring one to a very clear set of conclusions either. I find myself very ambivalent about the concept, very thrilled and excited about it as a theoretical element, component of a just transition, and at the same time very concerned about the politics of bringing about a UBI, about where the agency lies for taking this type of demand, this option forward, and about the political capacity to defend and sustain it into the future and keep it part of an arsenal of progressive interventions and changes we make to society, and to not have it captured from us. But having said that, even if we don't know the answers to these right now, I think unlike many of the other options on view, it confronts the fact that for tens of millions of South Africans, paid work is not an available and not a viable basis for a dignified life. It's a reality they have lived with for decades. It's a reality that shows no sign of changing in the foreseeable future. And it's for that simple reason that I think a UBI has to be a clear-headed and clear-eyed option for our future discussions and debates. Thanks so much.